This video explains some work that Julie Montione and I have been doing over the years. It started with grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then we've been developing it and expanding it and looking at the way that ancient tragedy can actually be a means of healing for people that have experienced trauma. A good starting point is to understand that the ancient Athenians invented acting. As you know it, they invented both tragedy and comedy. It becomes quite popular, and it's in the city of Athens in particular that this develops. Not in all of Greece, but in Athens in the 5th century, during a time when they were at constant warfare. And it's not a coincidence, as you'll see. The warfare seems to be the ideal context for the development of tragedy. So Aristotle looks at this, and he thinks it's strange that people enjoy tragedy since it elicits negative emotions. In particular, he thinks tragedy makes people feel sadness, often translated as pity, and he thinks people also feel a great deal of fear, and he doesn't understand why people are pleased by this in a way. But he comes to the conclusion that because tragedy is a fiction and only an imitation of reality, the audience is actually relieved of their negative emotions. He writes this in a work called The Poetics, where he kind of analyzes what tragedy is. And the people that watch these tragedies don't suffer genuine fear or sadness or pity or any other negative emotions. They get a small taste of these emotions and then they feel better as a result. The word he uses for this is a medical term that'll be important later. It's a medical term, catharsis, and that's originally used to refer to the process of your body getting rid of what is making you feel sick, like when you throw up and you feel better afterwards. So Aristotle thinks that tragedy provides a catharsis for your psyche. Now that's a Greek word for the mind. And most people can see that Aristotle's onto something with his theory of catharsis. Even today, people enjoy horror films and sad movies because in spite of negative emotions, there's still a sense of enjoyment. Now, in addition to Aristotle's ancient theory in the Poetics, that tragedy produces a catharsis of negative emotions, there's a modern psychiatrist. His name is Jonathan Shea. He's worked largely with Vietnam veterans. He became interested in a theory by Aristotle, and he makes a brilliant argument that Athenian tragedy is a theater of combat veterans, by combat veterans, and for combat veterans that offers a form of cultural therapy for an audience that's been traumatized by the effects of war. That seems to be very factually accurate. In ancient Athens, when 100% of the male citizen population was expected to fight, and without exception, any able-bodied man engaged in hand-to-hand combat on almost a yearly basis, and at the time that tragedy was developed, it was about 100 years of almost constant warfare. The authors, the actors who were all male, and the audience had all known war. The women, children, slaves, and foreigners in the city of Athens also witnessed war outside the city gates and in the towns and villages almost yearly. So what Shea thinks is that the Athenians developed this method of coming together as a community to watch these stories as a way to heal their psyches. Every tragedy we know of, there's only 33 that survive, but we have summaries and fragments and titles of hundreds more. Every one deals with a world that knows war. I'll break down what the subject of the specific tragedies are, and you'll see that they're very much oriented around war as well. But the inescapable truth is that all Athenian tragedy, wherever the setting was set in a world that knew almost constant warfare. It's not the way it is in the United States today. We have been at war constantly in recent decades, but it's not something that you see outside of your house. It's not something where the majority or the entire male population is engaged in. The work that Shea writes is called Odysseus in America. And what you have to understand in addition is that these tragic festivals happen 3 times a year where they gather as a community to drink wine, worship their gods. The Festival of the Tragedies is also a religious event, and relieve their negative emotions. Now, I mentioned that all these tragedies are set in a world that knows war, but even if you look at the numbers themselves, 24 out of 33 are specifically about planning a war set in the context of war and the aftermath of war. War is their main topic. In addition, the rest of them are about tragic situations. 16 of 33 are about killing family members. Now, again, many of these are overlaps. Some of the people that get killed are in the aftermath of war or because of war or in the context of war. 8 of 33 involve suicide. Most of them are carried out. Some of them are just planned. Again, often in the context of war or because of war. Heracles is the main hero, usually called Hercules in Latin or in English. He's a veteran. So every time you read about Heracles, don't forget that he is someone who has been through combat on a regular basis, very often in his life. 3 of them involve self-sacrifice. Someone is willing to die or die for a family member. It's not exactly suicide, but it's in very closely related, obviously. And then 3 out of 33 are focused on the idea of betrayal, that someone is betrayed very significantly in a life or death kind of way. And this is sometimes against a war comrade or sometimes against a family member. There is one outlier called Prometheus Bound. It's about the violent punishment of Prometheus. It's not a pleasant scene that's described. He's rescued by Hercules. We've just mentioned he's a war veteran. So again, you have that person in there, that person that's related to combat. And I mentioned that these festivals happen 3 times a year. They're festivals in honor of the god Dionysus, because he gives the gift of wine to humanity. And they're also have a connection to the god Apollo, who is the one that creates the music or gives the inspiration for the music in large part. Because these tragedies, so-called, not like plays, they're more like musicals. There's dancing and singing involved. Not exactly like an opera, but probably more like a modern musical. They're all chanted and sung. There's musical accompaniment. There's frequent dancing. So the god Dionysus is the main god that's honored in these festivals. And he is honored in particular for his gift of wine. And the festivals are competitions, religious competitions to create the best performance. But they're also festivals that involve drinking of wine. Now, what's important about this is that in ancient medical texts and in tragic stories, both in medical textbooks and tragic stories, it's stated over and over again that wine is a medicine. You don't think of wine as a medicine, but the Greeks think of wine as a medicine in particular for grief, anxiety, and sadness. In other words, negative emotions, just like the tragedies are. So they pair this medicine, as they think of it, with the tragedies. It's stated in both of the medical textbooks and tragic texts that wine is a medicine for the psyche. So again, these festivals are communal. They provide a catharsis for the psyche, according to Aristotle, just in the play itself. And whether or not we think wine is a good medicine for the mind, the Greeks did. And if you know anything about modern medical research, especially in pharmaceuticals, you understand the power of the placebo. The placebo is a medicine. Well, I shouldn't say it's a medicine. Placebo is a pill that you're given, for example, or a treatment that you're given. It doesn't have to be in the form of a pill. The placebo is a treatment or a medicine that you're given that actually has no active ingredient. It's often described as a sugar pill. So you get a pill that has no active ingredient except for, let's say, sugar, and you take that pill, but you're told it's a medicine in a drug trial or in a research experiment. You're told this placebo has medicine in it, and then often you get healed. Okay, so the placebo effect is when you take a medicine that you are convinced is working, but it doesn't have any active ingredient. And you test that against medicine that does have an active ingredient. One patient gets the placebo, one patient gets the real medicine, and you see which one has a greater outcome. Well, the placebo is very reliable, and the placebo is that which you have to test modern medicine against. Does it outperform the placebo? That's how powerful and regularly placebos heal. The word for medicine comes from the same root as the word for mind. So there's a large degree of healing that is attributable to the placebo effect or just your mind. There's no other explanation for the placebo effect except that you believe it works, and so it does. And remember, the Greeks thought that wine was a medicine for negative emotions. These kind of quotations occur both in the rational medical tradition, and you'll see that there's also what you might call the irrational medical tradition, which is based more on belief again. But even in the medical tradition in which they prescribe drugs, ancient medicines, and surgery and things like this, and physical therapies, even in the rational medical tradition familiar today to you, founded largely by Hippocrates. Hippocratic Oath is still talked about in modern medicine. Here's a quotation, one among many, where he says, "Anxiety, yawning rigor, wine drunk with an equal proportion of water removes these complaints, as if it's a drug for anxiety." Wine is mental health therapy. Again, here's Rufus of Ephesus. He says that wine has the ability to alter the state of the psyche. He says wine is a pharmacon. That's the word they use for every kind of different drug you would think of for grief. Now, the peculiar part is that Euripides says exactly the same kind of thing. He says wine ends grief for mortals. It ends this negative feeling. What's really interesting is that Euripides borrows an amazing amount of vocabulary and technical jargon from the medical tradition. He uses so much that people can't believe that he's borrowing all this medical terminology. Some people think that the medical tradition is actually borrowing from Euripides because Euripides is a popular author. Why would Euripides be reading medical terminology? Why would he be reading medical textbooks? Well, as you'll see, it seems that the tragedians know that they're healers. They know that they're involved in a healing process. The Greeks thought of tragedy, just like Jonathan Shea describes, as a process for healing your psyche. And Euripides was interested in not only tragedy as a form of healing, but also the rational medical tradition. The Greeks located, in fact, their theater directly adjacent to one of their healing sanctuaries, which is called the Asclepion. All the Greeks did this, not just the Athenians. Once tragedy was invented in Athens and spread abroad, they built their theater right next to their healing sanctuary. Now, the healing sanctuary of Asclepius involved you going to the temple, paying a fee, probably doing some kind of other ritualistic activities, saying a prayer maybe, and then you sleep at night. And if the god comes to you in a dream, you know you've been healed. And we have thousands of testimonies saying that people were healed. Seems to be the placebo effect to me. But what's important also to note is that at the Asclepion, there were also performances just like there were in the tragic theaters. Now, in addition to the Asclepion, that kind of, religious healing sanctuary located right next to the theaters, you had the rational tradition, most notably Hippocrates. Now, look at the spectrum of healing methods that are all related in Greece. Hippocrates is the rational medical tradition. Euripides borrows so much language from Hippocrates, it's almost strange. Why would he borrow so much medical terminology and jargon? So many phrases. Some people even think that Hippocrates is borrowing from Euripides. But at any rate, these people, Euripides and Hippocrates, are both part of the spectrum of healing. Sophocles is one of the people that helps bring the cult of Asclepius to Athens. And then they locate that cult directly next to the theater where Sophocles' plays were performed. Aeschylus was accused of revealing the secret behind the Eleusinian mysteries. What's the secret behind the Eleusinian mysteries? The secret behind the Eleusinian mysteries is that they ingest a psychedelic drink, similar to like what LSD is. It's barley and water and has a certain fungus on it, and they boil it. They do it once in their lifetime. It's not recreational. It's a very serious ritual. What's interesting about this, though, is that modern research at Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College in London and other places show that psychedelics are helpful for people with anxiety, depression, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So the Greeks knew what they were doing. Aeschylus knew what the mysteries were about. Euripides knows that there's value to the rational medical tradition. And Sophocles sees how often the shrine of Asclepius heals people. The same people that wrote tragedies also were involved in other ways of healing, this spectrum of healing, this medical complex that the Greeks made use of. They did the mind and the body. These are largely the placebo effect. These are largely psychological methods of healing, except for the rational medical tradition. But they all seem to work. We know this from modern research. And here's a small sampling of popularizing books on this. This was the book that started it. This is done by among one of the authors of this book from the 1970s, Albert Hofmann, the guy who discovered LSD. And they write in this book not only the history and the archaeology and the the tragic details about it, the stories about it, but they also write about the chemistry in in great detail. What's also interesting about Eleusis, this is called the Road to Eleusis, is that Eleusis there was a performance, and at the Asclepion there was a performance. So in this medical tradition, there's a performance. In this religious ritual, there's a performance. We know that they're using some kind of a psychedelic here, which is helpful to the mind. We know that they're using the power of the mind to heal people at the Asclepion. So this is the book that kind of started this research rolling. And then in 2020, this book came out called The Immortality Key. And this shows how this thesis right here is provable and demonstrable around the world, the Mediterranean world, in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe. Very well researched book right here, but also easy to read. And finally, Michael Pollan, who usually writes about things like food, he does a good job summarizing the research of modern psychedelics, about how psychedelics can be helpful to people with mental illness. And that's exactly what the Greeks were doing. They also added psychedelics very often to their wine. So think about that. When they went and watched the tragedies to heal their psyches, they were also drinking wine, which they thought of as a medicine for the psyche, but they also added psychedelics to it. So when you put this all together, you see that what Greek tragedy actually is part of the healing process for the ancient Greeks, in particular for people who have been through war.